The drifter never told anyone why he turned back. He had already crossed the ridge, the town behind him, the mountains ahead wide and empty. But something made him stop, something made him listen. And when he found her, bleeding, half-conscious, her breath shallow in the dust, he made a choice that would cost him everything. By the time the clan came looking, he was already gone, and so was she. Montana in the spring of 1885 was a place where the land still decided who lived and who didn't. The towns were small and scattered, connected by roads that turned to mud or dust depending on the week. The people who lived there were the kind who didn't ask many questions, because most folks had come west to escape the answers. The town of Ridgway sat in a shallow basin between two long stretches of pine-covered hills. It had a main street, a mercantile, a boarding house, and a saloon that doubled as the only place to hear news from elsewhere. The railroad had passed it by 3 years earlier, and the town had been slowly dying ever since. The people who stayed were the ones with nowhere else to go, or nothing left to run from. He rode in on a Thursday afternoon, just as the wind was picking up from the west. Nobody knew his name. He didn't offer it, and no one pressed. He was tall, lean, with a weathered face that suggested he'd spent more time sleeping under stars than roofs. His clothes were dusty, his hat pulled low. He carried a rifle across his saddle and a sidearm on his hip, but he didn't carry himself like a gunfighter. He moved like someone who wanted to be forgotten. He tied his horse outside the saloon and went inside. The bartender, a man named Calhoun with thinning hair and a permanent squint, poured him whiskey without a word. The drifter sat at the far end of the bar, his back to the wall, and drank slowly. The drifter nodded. The drifter didn't answer. He finished his drink, set a coin on the bar, and walked out. He didn't look back. He camped that night a few miles outside town, up in the foothills where the trees grew thick and the ground was softer. He built a small fire, ate jerky and hardtack, and watched the stars come out one by one. He didn't sleep much. He never did. The next morning, he saddled up before dawn and rode north along the old freight trail. The air was cool, the sky wide and pale. He passed no one. The land rolled out in long waves of grass and stone, broken occasionally by stands of pine or the dark line of a distant creek. It was the kind of country that made a man feel small. He was halfway to the ridge when he heard it. A sound, faint, carried on the wind. He reined in his horse and sat still, listening. For a moment there was nothing. Then it came again. A low, strained noise, almost like a groan human. He turned his horse off the trail and moved slowly through the tall grass toward the sound. It took him a few minutes to find her. She was lying in a shallow ravine, half hidden by scrub and stone. Her clothing was torn, her face pale and streaked with dirt and dried blood. One leg was twisted beneath her at an unnatural angle. Her eyes were open, but barely. She didn't move when he dismounted. He knelt beside her and touched her shoulder gently. She flinched, her breath catching. She tried to speak, but the words came out broken and soft. He leaned closer. "Fell," she whispered. He looked around. There was no horse nearby, no saddle, no tracks, just her, alone in the ravine, broken and bleeding. He didn't ask her why she was out here. He didn't ask where she'd come from. Those were questions for later, if there was a later. He checked her injuries as carefully as he could. The leg was bad, probably broken in more than one place. There was a gash along her ribs, deep enough to worry about but not bleeding heavily anymore. She was dehydrated, weak, maybe in shock. If he left her here, she'd be dead by nightfall. He made his decision quickly. He lifted her as gently as he could, and she cried out once, sharp and breathless, before going limp in his arms. He carried her back to his horse, talking low and steady the whole time, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. He laid her across the saddle, secured her with his bedroll, and began walking north on foot, leading the horse by the reins. It was slow going. The terrain was rough, and he had to stop often to check on her. She drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring things he couldn't understand. She didn't answer, her eyes closed again. By midday, he'd found a place to stop. A small hollow sheltered by rock and pine, with a narrow creek running nearby. He built a fire, boiled water, and did what he could for her wounds. He wrapped her leg as best he could, cleaned the gash on her side, gave her water a few drops at a time. She was burning with fever now, her skin hot to the touch. He didn't know if she'd make it through the night. He stayed with her. He didn't know why. That evening, as the light faded and the fire burned low, he heard the sound of horses in the distance, faint at first, then growing louder. He stood and moved to the edge of the hollow, staying low, and looked out over the valley below. There were riders, 5, maybe 6. Moving slowly along the trail he'd taken that morning, searching. He watched them for a long time. They didn't look like lawmen. They didn't move like a posse. They moved like hunters, methodical, patient, dangerous. He returned to the fire and sat down beside the woman. She was still unconscious, her breathing shallow and uneven. He looked at her face, pale in the firelight, and wondered who she was, what she'd done, why these men were looking for her, and why he'd chosen to save her. The riders passed without finding them, but he knew they'd be back. The woman woke just before dawn. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused, and she stared up at the branches overhead without moving. She closed her eyes and took a slow, shaky breath. He waited. He studied her for a moment. "They do that to you." He gestured toward her leg. She shook her head. He didn't press. He poured water into a tin cup and helped her drink. She took a few sips, then pushed it away gently. "You need to leave me," she said quietly. "If they find you with me, they won't ask questions." He didn't answer. He didn't have a good answer. She looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. He stood and walked to the edge of the hollow, looking out over the valley. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the hills in shades of gold and red. The air was cold and clean. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried. "Because someone has to," he said finally. She didn't respond. When he turned back, she was staring at the fire, her jaw tight, her eyes wet. They stayed in the hollow for 2 more days. He hunted small game, kept the fire low, changed her bandages. She didn't talk much, but when she did, it was in short, careful sentences. She told him her name was Rain. She told him the clan controlled a stretch of land in the high country, that they didn't answer to law or government, that they lived by their own rules. She shook her head. "My uncle is." The drifter didn't say anything. He stared into the fire, his face unreadable. The next morning he helped her onto the horse. She was stronger now, but still weak. The fever had broken, but the leg was bad. She wouldn't be able to walk on it for weeks. Maybe longer. They rode north, keeping to the high ground, avoiding the trails. He moved carefully, watching the land, listening for sounds that didn't belong. She sat in front of him, leaning back against his chest, her breathing slow and steady. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't seem to care. It was late afternoon when they reached the old trading post. It sat alone at the base of a rocky bluff, half collapsed and long abandoned. The door hung crooked on its hinges. The windows were empty, but the roof was mostly intact, and it was shelter. He glanced at her. He thought about it for a moment. She stared at him, her expression caught between frustration and something softer, something like gratitude. But she didn't say it. That night, as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled low, he sat by the window and watched the darkness. He didn't know how much time they had. A day, maybe. Maybe less. He looked over at her. She was asleep, her face peaceful for the first time since he'd found her. And for a moment he let himself believe it might be enough. Then he heard the sound of hoofbeats in the distance. The first anyone in Ridgeway knew something was wrong came 3 days after the drifter had ridden out. A group of riders appeared at dawn, moving down the main street in a tight formation that made the handful of early risers step back from their windows. There were 8 of them, all dressed in dark wool and leather, their faces hard and weather-beaten. They moved with the kind of coordination that spoke of years riding together, of shared purpose and unquestioned loyalty. They stopped at the saloon. The leader, a man in his 40s with iron-gray hair and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, dismounted and went inside. Calhoun shook his head slowly. Calhoun hesitated. The drifter's face flashed through his mind. The quiet man at the end of the bar, the one who'd asked for nothing and offered less. Calhoun nodded slowly. There was a man like that few days back, had a drink and left. The man turned and walked out without another word. Within minutes, the riders were gone, heading up the freight trail in a cloud of dust. Calhoun stood at the door and watched them disappear. He didn't know who they were looking for or why, but he knew enough about men like that to understand one thing. Whoever they were hunting was already as good as dead. By that evening, word had spread through Ridgeway. The riders were from the high country, the clan that lived up in the mountains, the ones people whispered about but rarely saw. They kept to themselves, settled their own disputes, and made it clear that outsiders weren't welcome. Most folks in town had never met anyone from the clan. Those who didn't talk about it much. The town's part-time marshal, an aging man named Hewitt who spent most of his days playing cards at the boarding house, heard about the riders and made a point of staying out of sight. He had no interest in getting involved in clan business. The law ended where their territory began and everyone knew it, but there were questions. Why were they looking for a woman? Why would a drifter take her? And where had they gone? Nobody had answers. And as the days passed, the questions faded into the background noise of small-town life. People had their own problems. The spring rains had been heavy, flooding fields and washing out roads. Crops needed planting. Roofs needed fixing. A missing woman and a nameless drifter became just another story, told once or twice over whiskey and then forgotten. But not by everyone. Up in the high country, the clan did not forget. Rain's disappearance had torn through the settlement like a blade. She had been one of them, born into the family, trained from childhood, trusted with responsibilities that outsiders could never understand. Her leaving wasn't just betrayal. It was a wound that cut to the heart of everything they believed. Her uncle, the man who led the clan, was a figure of quiet authority. His name was Garrett, and he had spent 30 years building the clan into something that could survive in a world that wanted to swallow them whole. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he spoke, people listened. When Rain's horse had returned without her, blood on the saddle and terror in its eyes, Garrett had known immediately what had happened. She had tried to run. She had failed. And now she was out there, somewhere, either dead or dying or, worst of all, alive and beyond their reach. He sent Callan, his nephew and Rain's older brother, to find her. Callan was the best tracker the clan had ever produced. He could read the land like other men read books. He could find water where there was none, follow trails that had gone cold days earlier, and move through wilderness without leaving a trace. But even Callan struggled with this one. The drifter, whoever he was, knew how to disappear. He avoided the main trails, kept to high ground where tracks were harder to follow, and moved at a pace that suggested he understood he was being hunted. Callan found signs: a cold campfire, a trampled patch of grass, a thread of cloth caught on a branch, but never enough to close the distance. He followed them north for 2 weeks, pushing deeper into country that even the clan rarely traveled. The land grew rougher, the trees thicker, the air thinner. Twice he thought he was close. Twice he found nothing but empty camps and cold ashes. By the end of the 3rd week, he returned to the settlement empty-handed. Garrett listened to his report in silence, his face unreadable. When Callan finished, Garrett nodded once. "Keep looking," he said, and so Callan did. Over the next few months, the search became something else. Not a hunt anymore, but a vigil. Callan rode out every few weeks, following rumors and traces, chasing ghosts. Other members of the clan joined him from time to time, but the results were always the same. The drifter and Rain had vanished into the vastness of the frontier, swallowed by distance and time. Back in Ridgeway, life went on. The spring rains gave way to summer heat. The crops grew tall and golden. Travelers passed through, bringing news from the east and rumors from the west. The saloon stayed busy. The boarding house stayed full. Calhoun never forgot the drifter. Sometimes, late at night when the bar was empty, he'd think about the quiet man who'd sat at the end of the bar and asked for nothing. He wondered if he was still alive. He wondered if the woman was with him. He wondered if they'd made it. He never asked. Nobody did. The first false sighting came in August. A prospector passing through claimed he'd seen a man matching the drifter's description up near the territorial line, camped by a river with a woman who looked injured. Callan rode out to investigate and found nothing. No camp, no tracks, no sign anyone had been there in months. The second sighting came in October. A trapper reported seeing a couple moving through the high passes, heading west toward the coast. Callan followed the lead for a week before determining it was a homesteading family, not his sister. By winter, the sightings had become a steady trickle. A woman in a trading post 200 miles north, a man fitting the description seen in a mining camp near the Canadian border. A couple spotted at a river crossing in Idaho. None of them led anywhere. Callan began to understand what he was chasing. Not a person, but a shadow. The drifter had done what few men could. He'd vanished so completely that even the best tracker in the territory couldn't find him. But Callan didn't stop. He couldn't. Rain was his sister. And as long as there was a chance she was alive, he would keep looking. The seasons turned. Autumn became winter. Winter became spring. The town of Ridgway grew quieter as the railroad towns to the south pulled more people away. The saloon closed on Mondays. The boarding house raised its rates. Marshall Hewitt died in his sleep one cold February night, and nobody bothered to replace him. The story of the drifter and the woman became legend. People who hadn't been there claimed they'd seen him ride out. Others swore they'd heard the woman screaming in the night before she disappeared. The details shifted and changed with every telling, until the truth was buried under layers of rumor and invention. Some said the drifter had been a gunfighter running from a past he couldn't escape. Others claimed he'd been a deserter from the army or a wanted man with a price on his head. A few whispered that the woman hadn't been taken at all, that she'd gone willingly, that the two of them had fallen in love in the brief time before they fled. Nobody knew, and after a while nobody cared. By the spring of 1887, 2 years after the drifter had ridden out of Ridgway, Callan had stopped riding out as often. He still searched, but the fire had dimmed. He'd covered thousands of miles, followed hundreds of leads, spoken to countless people. He'd found nothing. Garrett never told him to stop, but Callan could see it in his uncle's eyes. Rain was gone. Whether she was alive or dead didn't matter anymore. She had left the clan and the clan had moved on. But Callan hadn't, and he never would. In 1889, a fur trader passing through Ridgway mentioned that he'd heard a story up in the Bitterroot Range about a hermit living in the mountains with a woman who never came down to the settlements. Callan rode out one last time, spent 3 weeks combing the high country, and returned with nothing. After that, he stopped looking. The years passed. The town of Ridgway continued its slow decline. The mercantile closed. The boarding house became a boarding room. Calhoun sold the saloon to a younger man and moved south to live with his daughter. The people who'd known the drifter died or moved away, taking their memories with them. The legend remained, but even that began to fade. By the turn of the century, the story was rarely told. The drifter and the woman became just another piece of forgotten history, buried beneath the weight of time. The clan endured. Garrett passed leadership to Callan in 1893, and Callan led them into the new century with the same quiet authority his uncle had shown. He married, had children, taught them the ways of the high country. He never spoke of rain, and after a while the younger members of the clan didn't even know she'd existed. But sometimes, late at night, Callan would sit by the fire and stare into the flames, and he would wonder. The breakthrough came in the spring of 1978, nearly a century after the drifter had vanished. A young graduate student named Sarah Calloway was researching frontier migration patterns for her thesis. She'd been working her way through dusty archives in small-town historical societies across Montana, looking for immigration records, census data, anything that might shed light on how people moved through the territory in the 1880s. She was in the basement of what had once been the Ridgway Town Hall, now a museum that opened 2 days a week, when she found the box. It was unmarked, shoved into a corner behind a stack of old ledgers. Inside were personal effects that had been collected over the years, unclaimed letters, lost items, things left behind by people who'd moved on or died without family to collect their belongings. Most of it was unremarkable. But near the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth that had long since dried and cracked, she found a small leather journal. The cover was worn smooth, the pages yellowed and brittle. There was no name on it, but when she opened it carefully, she saw handwriting on the first page. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned the pages. The journal was a record, brief, fragmented, but unmistakable. It documented a journey north, through high country, across rivers, over mountains. It spoke of fear and pain and exhaustion, but it also spoke of something else: hope. The entries were dated. The first was from April of 1885. The last was from June of the same year. And between them was a story Sarah had never heard before. A story of a woman named Rain who had tried to escape something terrible, and a man who had helped her for reasons he never fully explained. Sarah read the journal 3 times that first night. Then she began to dig deeper. She found mentions of the Klan in old territorial records. She found a single newspaper article from 1886 about a group of writers searching for a missing woman. She found census records that showed the population of Ridgway dropping steadily after 1885. And she found something else: a land deed filed in 1887 for a small homestead in northern Idaho. The name on the deed was listed as R.N.J. Keller. No first names, no address, just initials. Sarah sat back in her chair and stared at the document. It might mean nothing. It might be a coincidence, or it might be them. She made copies of everything. She wrote letters to archives in Idaho, to county clerks, to anyone who might have records from that time period. She spent months following the thread, piecing together fragments of a story that had been lost for nearly a century. And slowly the picture began to emerge: 2 people living quietly in the wilderness, a man and a woman, no children, no visitors. They traded furs and occasionally came into a small settlement to buy supplies, but they kept to themselves. The locals remembered them as polite but distant. They never caused trouble. They lived that way for years. And then, sometime around 1900, they disappeared again. Sarah couldn't find death records, couldn't find a sale of the property, couldn't find anything that explained where they'd gone or what had happened to them. But she had the journal, and she had the deed, and she had a name, Keller. She didn't know if it was real or invented. Didn't know if they'd stayed together or parted ways. Didn't know if they'd lived out their lives in peace, or if the past had finally caught up with them. But she knew one thing. For a brief moment in the spring of 1885, a man had chosen to save a woman he didn't know. And that choice had changed both of their lives forever. Sarah published her findings in a small academic journal. The article didn't get much attention. A few historians read it, nodded appreciatively, and moved on. The journal itself was donated to the Montana Historical Society, where it sits today in a climate-controlled vault, available to researchers by appointment. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, Sarah thinks about them. The drifter and the woman. She wonders if they made it. If they found what they were looking for. She likes to think they did. And somewhere in the high country where the mountains meet the sky and the wind carries voices from the past, maybe they're still there, not as ghosts or legends. Sarah Calloway, returned to Montana 3 more times after her initial discovery. Each visit pulled her deeper into a story that had no clear ending, only fragments scattered across a century like pieces of a broken mirror. She interviewed descendants of the clan, though most were reluctant to speak about the past. She combed through homestead records and territorial maps. She drove dirt roads into the high country, searching for signs of the cabin that might have been theirs. She never found it, but she found other things. In a county archive in northern Idaho, she discovered a doctor's ledger from 1888. In it, a single entry: treatment provided to a woman with an improperly healed leg fracture. No name given. Payment made in cash. The description matched what Sarah knew of Rain's injuries. The location was less than 40 miles from where the Keller homestead had been registered. In a cemetery outside a town that no longer existed, she found 2 graves, simple wooden markers, weathered beyond recognition. The groundskeeper's records listed them only as J.K. and R.K. died 1903 and 1907 respectively. No other information. No family listed. No one left to remember them. Sarah stood there for a long time, the wind moving through the grass around her feet, and wondered if she was looking at the end of their story. She wrote a book. It took her 4 years. She titled it The Vanishing, and it was published by a small university press that specialized in regional history. The book wove together everything she'd found: the journal, the land deed, the doctor's ledger, the graves. She included maps and photographs, copies of original documents, interviews with historians and descendants. She also included something else, a chapter she debated including for months. It was about Callan. Through her research, Sarah had discovered that Rain's brother had lived until 1946, passing away at the age of 83. In his final years, he'd been cared for by his granddaughter, a woman named Margaret, who was still alive when Sarah tracked her down in a nursing home in Missoula. Margaret was in her 80s herself, her mind sharp but her body frail. She sat in a wheelchair by a window overlooking a stand of pine trees, and she listened carefully as Sarah explained who she was and what she was researching. When Sarah mentioned Rain's name, Margaret's expression changed. Something flickered in her eyes: recognition, or perhaps pain. Margaret was silent for a moment, her gaze distant. He said she was the bravest person he'd ever known. Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. Margaret nodded slowly. Years later, after most of the old guard had passed, someone told him the truth about what had been done to her, about why she tried to run. She paused, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. But Margaret shook her head. Some things aren't mine to tell. All I know is that my grandfather carried that weight until the day he died. He told me once that if he could go back, he would have helped her leave. Not an escape from something as simple as rules or tradition. An escape from something darker, something the clan had kept hidden even from its own members. Margaret reached out and touched Sarah's hand. If you write about her, tell people she was brave. Don't let her be remembered as someone who just ran away. She ran towards something. Sarah promised she would. The book was published in 1981. It sold modestly, mostly to academics and history enthusiasts. A few newspapers in Montana ran small reviews. A regional magazine did a feature on Sarah's research. But mostly it passed quietly into the world, one more account of frontier life among thousands. But something unexpected happened. People began to write to Sarah. Letters arrived at the university where she taught, forwarded from the publisher, sent to the historical societies she'd worked with. They came from across the country, from descendants of homesteaders and trappers and traders who'd lived in Montana and Idaho in the 1880s and 90s. Some of them had stories. An elderly woman in Oregon wrote that her grandmother had once mentioned meeting a quiet couple in the mountains who'd helped her when her wagon broke down. The woman had been kind, the man reserved but capable. They'd shared food and helped repair the wheel and sent her on her way. The grandmother had always remembered them because they'd seemed so isolated, so alone, yet somehow content. A man in Washington sent copies of letters his great-uncle had written, mentioning a hermit who traded furs at a remote outpost. The hermit never said much, but he always asked about news from Montana, always wanted to know if anyone had been asking about him. A descendant of a doctor who'd practiced in northern Idaho sent a memoir the doctor had written late in life. In it, he mentioned treating a woman with a badly healed leg fracture. He wrote that she'd been accompanied by a man who'd clearly cared for her deeply, who'd stayed by her side through the entire examination, who'd paid without question and left without giving a name. The doctor had noted something else. The woman had smiled when the man wasn't looking, a small, private smile, the smile of someone who'd found something worth keeping. Sarah read every letter. She kept them in a box in her office, a growing collection of fragments that suggested the drifter and Rain had lived longer than the graves implied. Or perhaps the graves were someone else entirely. Perhaps they'd moved on again. Perhaps they'd never stopped moving. Or perhaps they'd simply become the kind of people history forgets, not because they didn't matter, but because they'd chosen to live outside the boundaries where records were kept and names were remembered. Sarah liked that idea. She hoped it was true. In 1992, Sarah received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph, old, sepia-toned, mounted on cardboard that had begun to curl with age. The back was stamped with the name of a photography studio in Spokane, Washington. The date, 1896. The photograph showed two people standing in front of a simple wooden cabin, a man and a woman. The man was tall and lean, his face weathered, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. The woman stood beside him, one hand resting lightly on his arm. She was looking at the camera, her expression calm and steady. She stood with a cane, her weight shifted to one side. There was no note, no explanation, just the photograph. Sarah stared at it for hours. She couldn't prove it was them. The faces were too distant, the image too faded. But something in the way they stood together, in the quiet strength visible even through the blur of age and time, made her believe. She had the photograph analyzed. The paper was consistent with the period. The studio had existed, though it had closed in 1902. There was no way to identify the subjects. No names in the studio's surviving records matched. But Sarah kept it. She framed it and hung it in her office, and sometimes students would ask about it. She'd tell them the story, not as fact but as possibility, as something that might have been true. And maybe that was enough. By the time Sarah retired in 2006, the story of the drifter and Rain had become something different than it had been when she first found the journal. It was no longer just a historical curiosity. It had become a kind of touchstone, a reminder that even in the harshest places, even in times when survival was uncertain and mercy rare, people still made choices that defied explanation. The drifter could have kept writing. He had no reason to stop, no obligation to the woman bleeding in the ravine. He could have reported what he'd found and let someone else handle it. He could have done 100 things that would have been easier, safer, more reasonable. But he hadn't, and Rain could have stayed. Could have accepted the life she'd been born into, could have endured what so many others endured, could have survived by becoming smaller, quieter, less. But she hadn't. They'd chosen each other, or perhaps they'd chosen the possibility that something better existed beyond the ridge. And in choosing, they'd become something more than the sum of their individual stories. Sarah gave her last lecture on a cold afternoon in December. The classroom was half empty, just a dozen students who'd signed up for her seminar on frontier narratives. Sarah considered the question. She'd been asked it dozens of times over the years, and her answer had changed each time, shaped by new discoveries, new perspectives, new understandings of what making it meant. "I think they survived," she said finally. Whether they made it in the way we think of, growing old together, finding peace, building something lasting, I don't know. But they had years, years they wouldn't have had otherwise, years that belonged to them and no one else. The student nodded, though she didn't look entirely satisfied. Sarah understood. People wanted certainty. They wanted endings that felt complete, stories that tied up neatly. But history didn't work that way, and neither did life. After the lecture, Sarah walked across campus to her office one last time. She packed up her books, her notes, the letters people had sent over the years. She took down the photograph from the wall and wrapped it carefully in tissue paper. Before she left, she stood at the window and looked out over the valley. Snow was beginning to fall, light and steady, covering the ground in white. In the distance, the mountains rose against the darkening sky. She thought about all the people who'd walked into those mountains over the years. The ones who'd come back and the ones who hadn't. The ones whose names were remembered and the ones who'd vanished without a trace. She thought about the weight of choosing to save someone, the weight of choosing to be saved. And she thought about the silence that followed, the years of wondering and searching and hoping, the cost of not knowing whether the choice had been worth it. Callan had died not knowing. Garrett had died not knowing. The whole clan had moved on without ever learning what had become of Rain. But maybe that was its own kind of answer. Maybe the fact that she was never found, never caught, never brought back meant something. Meant she'd succeeded in the only way that mattered. She'd gotten free. Sarah locked her office door and walked out into the snow. She didn't know what she'd do with the photograph. Part of her wanted to donate it to the Montana Historical Society, to let it join the journal in the archive. Part of her wanted to keep it, to hold onto the possibility it represented. In the end, she did both. She donated copies of everything she'd collected, the letters, the documents, the research notes, but she kept the photograph. She took it home and placed it on a shelf in her living room, where the light from the window would touch it each morning. And sometimes, when she sat in her chair with a cup of coffee and watched the sun rise over the hills, she'd look at those two figures standing in front of the cabin and imagine the life they'd built. She imagined quiet mornings and long winters. She imagined the work of survival, hunting, trapping, building, mending. She imagined the moments of stillness between the labor, when they'd sit together and watch the mountains turn gold in the fading light. She imagined them growing older. The man's hair turning gray, his movements slower but still sure. The woman's leg aching on cold days but her spirit unbroken. She imagined them speaking less as the years passed, not because they had nothing to say, but because they'd learned to communicate in silence. She imagined them content. Not happy in the bright, uncomplicated way stories often demanded, but content in the way people are when they've found a life that fits them, even if it's hard, even if it's lonely, even if the rest of the world has forgotten they exist. And she imagined that when the end came, for one and then eventually the other, it came quietly. In the cabin they'd built together, in the mountains that had sheltered them, surrounded by the silence that had become their home. No one to record it, no one to mark the moment. Just two lives folding gently into the earth, leaving nothing behind but the land itself and the faintest trace of a story that most people would never hear. Sarah closed her eyes and let herself believe it was true. Years later, after Sarah had passed away herself, a graduate student working on a project about women in the American West came across her research. The student read the book, studied the documents, and eventually made her own trip to Montana. She walked the same roads Sarah had walked. She stood in the same archives. She held the journal carefully in gloved hands and read the same words Sarah had read decades earlier. And she understood what Sarah had understood, that some stories don't have endings, they have echoes. The drifter in Rain had become an echo. A whisper carried on the wind through the high country, a possibility that lived in the space between what was known and what could only be imagined. They'd ridden north when anyone sensible would have stayed put. They'd chosen each other when the world gave them every reason not to. They'd vanished into the frontier and left behind only questions, and maybe that was the point. Maybe the story wasn't about where they went or how long they survived or whether they found peace. Maybe it was about the choice itself. The moment when a man turned his horse around and rode back towards something that wasn't his problem. The moment when a woman decided to trust a stranger with her life. The moment when both of them chose the uncertain future over the certain past. That moment, repeated across countless lives in countless places, was what built the West, not the famous names or the battles or the treaties, but the small, quiet choices people made when no one was watching and nothing was guaranteed. The choices that said, "I will not leave you behind." The choices that said, "I will try even if I fail." The choices that said, "There must be something better than this." Those choices lived on, even when the people who made them were forgotten. They lived on in the land itself, in the mountains and rivers and endless sky. They lived on in the stories passed down through generations, changing and shifting but never quite disappearing. And they lived on in the hearts of people who heard them and recognized something true, something worth remembering. The sun sets over the Montana high country same as it always has. The wind moves through the grass. The mountains stand patient and eternal against the horizon. And somewhere in that vastness, in the space between memory and myth, two figures stand together in front of a cabin that may or may not have existed. They don't speak. They don't need to. They simply stand, two people who chose each other when the world told them not to, and watch the light fade from gold to amber to darkness. And that is enough. That has always been enough.